Imagine you have built something extraordinary, a city, not of stone, not of empire, but of timber and clay and painted earth, streets arranged in concentric rings, thousands of homes, each one decorated with spiraling red and white designs that seem to move in the firelight. Your granaries are full, your children are growing, your community has thrived here for 2 generations. And then, one season, the elders gather. The decision is made, and you burn it all to the ground. Every house, every storehouse, every wall you have plastered and repainted through decades of life, you watch the smoke rise into the sky and carry everything you have built into nothing. Then you do it again and again for nearly 3,000 years. One civilization in prehistoric Europe made this choice over and over with what appears to be perfect, deliberate, unwavering intention. We do not know exactly why. That is what makes them one of the most haunting mysteries in all of human prehistory. The culture we are talking about is known today by 2 names, each reflecting a different national tradition of archaeology. In Romania, they are called the Cucuteni, named for a small village in the northeastern part of the country where their remains were first identified by archaeologists in the 1880s. In Ukraine, they are called the Tripilia, or Tripolier, named for a site near Kiev excavated around the same time. Most scholars today use both names together, the Cucuteni Tripilia culture. Whatever you call them, they represent one of the largest, most sophisticated, and most enigmatic civilizations of prehistoric Europe, a people who flourished for roughly 2,800 years, from approximately 5,500 to 2,750 years before the Common Era across what is now Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. To understand just how remarkable this civilization was, we need a point of comparison. The famous cities of ancient Mesopotamia, Uruk, Eridu, Ur, are celebrated as the cradles of urban life. Uruk, often called the world's first true city, reached a population of perhaps 50,000 at its height sometime around 3000 BCE. But here's the astonishing thing. While Mesopotamia was developing its first cities, the Cucuteni Tripilia people were already living in settlements that may have housed tens of thousands of people, in some cases, possibly more. And they had been doing so for centuries before Uruk reached its peak. These were not scattered hunter-gatherers. These were not simple farming villages. These were, by some measures, the largest settlements on Earth at the time. The territory this culture occupied was immense, an area of approximately 350,000 square kilometers, stretching from the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains in the west across the fertile river valleys of the Siret, the Prut, and the Dniester eastward to the Dnieper. This was prime agricultural land, the famous black soil of the Ukrainian steppe, where wheat and barley grew abundantly. The Cucuteni Tripilia people cultivated crops, raised cattle, kept sheep and goats and pigs. They managed their fields with remarkable sophistication, even using cattle manure to enrich soil that might otherwise have been exhausted within a generation. In short, they were not nomads scraping by on the margins of survival. They were farmers, builders, and craftspeople at the peak of their agricultural world. Their artistic output alone would set them apart. The pottery of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture is, by any measure, breathtaking. These were not simple utility vessels. They were hand-coiled, then shaped and polished, painted with intricate geometric designs, spirals, meanders, interlocking bands, in deep red, orange, black, and white. The spiral motif dominates. It appears on vessel after vessel in endless variations, swirling, turning, doubling back on itself. Scholars have interpreted this symbol as representing water, cosmic motion, the cycle of seasons, or the rhythm of life and death. No one knows for certain, but the sheer consistency of the spiral across centuries and across hundreds of kilometers of territory suggests it carried profound shared meaning for the people who made it. They also produced thousands of clay figurines, small, stylized representations of the human form, predominantly female. These figurines range from a few centimeters to larger, more elaborately decorated forms. Some are seated, some stand with arms raised, some are abstract to the point of near geometry. For decades, the scholar Maria Gimbutas championed the theory that these figurines represented a great goddess, that Cucuteni Tripilia society was a peaceful, matriarchal culture organized around female spiritual power. The figurines in her reading were objects of worship in a civilization fundamentally different from and superior to the patriarchal warrior cultures that eventually replaced it. Today, most archaeologists regard Gimbutas's framework as deeply romanticized and largely discredited. The figurines are real. Their meaning remains contested. But the figurines and the pottery, remarkable as they are not what makes this civilization truly singular. What sets the Cucuteni Tripilia people apart, what places them in a category of their own in the entire archaeological record of prehistoric Europe, is the scale of what they built and what they then chose to destroy. Beginning around 4,100 years before the Common Era and continuing through roughly 3,400 BCE, something extraordinary happened in the landscape of what is now central Ukraine. Villages that had previously housed hundreds of people began to grow and grow and grow until they became something that archaeologists, struggling for the right word, have come to call megasites. The megasites of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture are not a myth. They have been identified and partially excavated. Their outlines have been mapped through aerial photography and ground-penetrating radar surveys. Three of the largest and most studied are Taljanki, Majdanetske, and Nebelivka, all located in the forest steppe zone of what is now central Ukraine, roughly in the region of modern Cherkasy and Kirovohrad oblasts. Taljanki covers an area of approximately 340 hectares, roughly 840 acres, or about 4.5 times the size of Vatican City. Population estimates, always difficult for prehistoric sites, range from around 15,000 to as many as 21,000 inhabitants at peak occupation. Majdanetske, at approximately 270 hectares, may have housed between 12,000 and 46,000 people, with 29,000 as one scholarly estimate. Nebelivka, the most recently and thoroughly studied of the three, covers around 300 hectares and is estimated to have had roughly 15,000 residents around 4000 BCE. These numbers demand a moment of reflection. We are talking about the Neolithic period, a time when the wheel had only recently been invented, when metallurgy was in its earliest infancy in this region, when writing did not yet exist in Europe. And yet here were settlements in the forests and grasslands of prehistoric Ukraine that may have been home to tens of thousands of people, organized in concentric rings with streets, with assembly buildings, with granaries and workshops and kilns capable of firing pottery at temperatures between 900 and 1100 degrees Celsius. The largest of these sites predate the construction of Stonehenge. They predate the pyramids of Giza. They are among the largest settlements anywhere on Earth for their time, and almost no one in the modern world knows they exist. And now we arrive at the question that has haunted archaeologists since the moment they first understood what they were looking at. Every single one of these megasites, and apparently every settlement the Cucuteni Tripilia people ever built, large or small, it was burned, not burned in conquest, not burned by accident, burned deliberately, systematically, completely. The fires were so intense, so sustained, and so thorough that they transformed the raw clay walls of the houses into a form of fired ceramic, harder than the original mud brick preserved in the soil for more than 5,000 years. And this burning was not a one-time catastrophe. It happened again and again. Roughly every 60 to 80 years, an entire settlement was reduced to ash and rubble. Then almost always the people came back and built again on the same spot. Why? That is the question this story is about. To understand why the Cucuteni Tripilia people may have burned their cities, we need to first understand who they were, not as an abstract archaeological category, but as a living civilization. And to do that, we need to go back to the beginning. The earliest traces of this culture appear around 5,500 years before the Common Era, in the foothills and river valleys of what is now northeastern Romania and the Republic of Moldova. The name Cucuteni itself comes from a modest hilltop in the Iași region of Romania, where a local schoolteacher named Theodore Barada noticed unusual ceramic fragments eroding from the soil in 1884. He reported his find. Excavations followed, and slowly, over the subsequent decades, archaeologists began to realize they had stumbled onto something vast. In Ukraine, meanwhile, a Czech-born archaeologist named Vikentai Kavoika was making his own discoveries near the village of Trypilia, south of Kiev, in the 1890s. Kavoika found traces of a culture that left the same distinctive painted pottery, the same clay figurines, the same burned house floors. What neither he nor his Romanian counterparts initially understood was that these were the same people, a single, coherent cultural tradition stretching across an enormous arc of Eastern Europe. It took decades of cross-national archaeological work, interrupted by two world wars and the political divisions of the 20th century, before the full picture began to emerge. The culture was one, its extent was staggering. The earliest phase of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, running roughly from 5,500 to approximately 4,500 years before the Common Era, was characterized by relatively modest settlements, small villages of perhaps 20 to 50 structures clustered along riverbanks and valley terraces. But even in this early phase, certain patterns were already present. The pottery was already being painted with spirals and geometric bands. Clay figurines were already being produced, and the houses were already being burned. Not every settlement from this early period shows evidence of deliberate destruction. But where the evidence exists, it is consistent. The burning was controlled, intense, and left behind a specific signature in the archaeological record. What did a Cucuteni Tripilia house look like? We know in remarkable detail. The houses were built using a technique that was sophisticated for its time. First, a framework of wooden posts was erected, typically in a rectangular plan. Some houses measured as much as 700 square meters in floor area, which would be large even by modern standards. This wooden skeleton was then filled in and coated with a mixture of clay, chopped straw, and organic binders. The interior walls were plastered and smoothed, then painted, often with the same spiraling motifs that appeared on the pottery. The floors were of compacted clay, also smoothed and sometimes painted. The roofs were thatched. Some houses had 2 stories. Inside there would be a clay oven or hearth, raised clay platforms that served as sleeping areas or benches, storage vessels, and the accumulated tools and possessions of family life. The organization of these houses within a settlement was not random. Even in the smaller villages of the early phase, houses tended to be arranged in loose rows or clusters with open central spaces that may have served communal functions. As settlements grew through the middle phase of the culture, this organizational principle became more pronounced. In the megasites, the pattern became systematic and unmistakable. The houses were laid out in concentric oval rings, one inside the other, sometimes 4 or 5 rings deep, all oriented around a central open area. This central space was not built upon, it was left open. What happened there, whether it served as a marketplace, a gathering ground, a ceremonial space, or something else entirely, is another of the many questions this culture leaves unanswered. At Nebelivka, the megasite that has received the most intensive modern archaeological investigation, thanks in large part to the work of British and Ukrainian researchers, including John Chapman and Biserka Gajdarska, the excavations revealed something that added an important new dimension to our understanding of these sites. Scattered among the residential rings were larger structures, markedly bigger than typical houses, that appeared to serve community-wide functions. The largest of these so-called assembly buildings at Nebelivka measured approximately 1,200 square meters. That is roughly the footprint of a modern elementary school. It contained evidence of feasting, animal bones, large ceramic vessels, and appears to have been a gathering place for significant portions of the community. Chapman and Gajdarska have proposed that the megasites function not as conventional cities, but as something more like periodic assembly places, locations where dispersed populations gathered, perhaps seasonally, perhaps for ritual or social events. This interpretation, that the megasites were assembly places rather than permanently inhabited cities, is not universally accepted. Other scholars argue that the scale of investment in infrastructure, the density of houses, and the evidence of year-round occupation at many sites indicates genuine, permanent settlement. The debate reflects a broader problem. We are trying to fit a 5,000-year-old society into modern conceptual categories that may simply not apply. Were these cities seasonal gathering sites, something in between, places that swelled and contracted with the rhythms of the agricultural calendar and the demands of communal life? The honest answer is that we do not yet know. What we do know is that nothing quite like them existed anywhere else in the world at this moment in time. One of the most striking features of the Cucuteni Trypillia megasites, and one that has fueled the debate about their social structure, is what they appear to lack. In Mesopotamia, the first cities were organized around two dominant institutions, the temple and the palace. The temple managed redistributive economies, collected surplus grain, and coordinated labor through religious authority. The palace concentrated political and military power in a ruling elite. The physical footprint of these institutions, a massive, permanent, architecturally dominant, is visible in the archaeological record of Uruk, of Nippur, of ancient Jericho. In the Cucuteni Trypillia megasites, nothing comparable has been found. There are no temples rising above the rest of the settlement. There are no palaces. There are no storage complexes that would indicate centralized economic control. There are no royal tombs. This absence, the dog that did not bark, has led some researchers to propose something almost radical, that the Cucuteni Trypillia megasites represent a form of large-scale human organization that was fundamentally egalitarian. Not perfectly equal, no human society is, but structured without the stark hierarchies of accumulated wealth and coercive power that characterize most of the ancient civilizations we study. Research from Kiel University, examining the archaeological evidence for wealth inequality across Trypillia megasites, found that these settlements were associated with lower social inequality than comparable sites in other cultures of the period. House sizes varied, but not dramatically. Grave goods, where burials can be found, do not show the kind of extreme differentiation that marks elite societies. The evidence taken together suggests these were communities where, at least compared to their contemporaries, power was more diffuse. There is one aspect of this culture that archaeologists find particularly puzzling, and it connects directly to the question of burning. The Cucuteni Trypillia people left very few cemeteries. For a culture that lasted nearly 3,000 years and at its peak may have had a total population approaching 1 million people across its entire territory, the burial record is extraordinarily sparse. The primary mortuary site we know of from the earlier phases is Verteba Cave in western Ukraine, where human bones, mostly disarticulated, mixed with animal bones and pottery, have been found in a context that suggests repeated use over a long period. But formal cemeteries of the kind that leave a clear archaeological signature are essentially absent from the Cucuteni Trypillia record until very late in the culture's history. Where did the dead go? One answer, speculative but compelling, is that the act of burning may have served, at least in part, as a form of mortuary ritual. If the Cucuteni Trypillia people understood the house as a living entity, something that was born when it was built, that aged and grew through the decades of inhabitation, and that eventually died, then the burning of the house could represent the death of that entity. And if the possessions of the deceased were traditionally consigned to the flames along with the structure, then the burning of settlements could function as a collective funeral for the community's accumulated life. This theory, one of several proposed by archaeologists, would help explain both the absence of formal cemeteries and the consistent presence of household objects, pottery, figurines, tools, found within the burned structures. The house did not just die, it was given last rites. The term that archaeologists use for the broader phenomenon is the burned house horizon, a phrase coined by the British American archaeologist Ruth Tringham to describe the widespread pattern of deliberately burned Neolithic structures found across a broad swath of southeastern and eastern Europe. The horizon extends beyond the Cucuteni Tripilia culture alone. Burned house floors have been identified in Neolithic sites in Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary, Bosnia, Croatia, and Romania, spanning a period from roughly 6,500 to around 2,000 years before the Common Era. But nowhere is the phenomenon as consistent, as systematic, or as thoroughly documented as in the Cucuteni Tripilia heartland. Here, the burning was not occasional, it was universal. Every settlement, it appears, was eventually burned. How do we know the fires were deliberate? This is a critical question, and the answer is surprisingly robust. In the 1980s and 90s, archaeologists and experimental archaeologists began to study what an accidental fire leaves behind compared to a deliberately set one. In an accidental fire, the temperatures reached are generally insufficient to fire raw clay into ceramic material. The walls of a clay-plastered house collapse inward irregularly. Valuable objects are typically removed before or during the fire. In a genuine emergency, people grab what they can. The pattern left in the soil is chaotic, asymmetrical, incomplete. What the burned houses of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture show is almost the exact opposite of this. Experimental burns of replica Neolithic structures, including work carried out by archaeologist Mirjana Stevanovic and her colleagues, demonstrated several important things. First, to achieve the temperatures required to vitrify clay walls, to turn the raw daub into fired ceramic, you need an enormous quantity of additional fuel beyond the timber of the structure itself. Estimates suggest that burning a single one-story Cucuteni Tripilia house to the archaeological standard would have required the equivalent of around 130 full-grown trees worth of additional firewood. This is not what an accidental fire produces. This is a deliberate, sustained, organized incineration. Many someones, spent days or weeks gathering fuel and preparing the structure for destruction. Second, and equally important, inside the burned houses, the objects were still there: pottery, figurines, tools, grinding stones, seeds, and grain stored in ceramic vessels. These were not objects grabbed in panic. They were objects left behind, in many cases, arranged with apparent deliberateness. In some excavated houses, ceramic vessels had been stacked or organized before the burning. Figurines had been placed in specific locations. At several sites, objects were found arranged in ways that mirror what archaeologists interpret as ritual or ceremonial patterns. The contents of the houses were not looted before the fire. In fact, in many cases, it appears that household goods were specifically gathered and organized as part of the burning ritual: a deposit, a dedication, a final offering. Third, the timing. By correlating radiocarbon dates and stratigraphic sequences across multiple sites, archaeologists have been able to establish that the burnings at a given settlement did not happen randomly or frequently or rarely. They happened on a cycle. The commonly cited figure, one that has made its way into popular accounts of this culture, including the striking framing of our title today, is approximately every 60 to 80 years. It is important to be precise here. 60 to 80 years is an average, derived from limited data, and it varies by site and by period. The popular shorthand of 60 years is a simplification of a more complex and still debated scholarly picture. But the pattern itself, periodic, recurring, site-wide burning, is not in dispute. It is one of the best documented features of this culture. Think about what a 60 to 80 year cycle means in human terms. In a world without precise calendars, without written records, without clocks, a world measured by harvests and winters and the memory of living elders, 60 to 80 years is roughly one human lifetime. It is the age of the oldest members of the community. It is the span of living memory. If a settlement was burned when it was approximately 60 years old, then no one alive at the time of the burning would have witnessed the last burning. The knowledge of why the burning happened, what it meant, and how it was done would have been transmitted not through personal experience, but through oral tradition, through story, through ritual instruction. The burning was not something you remembered seeing, it was something you had been taught. This observation opens onto one of the deepest questions in the archaeology of this culture. What was the cognitive and spiritual framework within which the burning made sense? What story did these people tell themselves about their houses, about their settlements, about time and renewal that made the organized destruction of everything they had built not a tragedy, but a necessity? We will probably never know for certain, but we can examine the competing theories that scholars have proposed and we can evaluate what the evidence supports. The first and oldest theory is the most obvious one, accident or attack. Perhaps the settlements burned accidentally, when the cooking fire escaping, a hearth overturned, a stray spark from a smithy landing on a thatched roof. Perhaps they were burned by enemies, raiding parties from neighboring cultures, or internal conflicts that ended in violence and fire. This theory was the default assumption of early 20th century archaeologists who tended to project their own era's experience of warfare and catastrophe onto the past. But the experimental and stratigraphic evidence has largely dismantled it. Accidental fires do not produce the consistent temperatures required to vitrify clay walls across an entire settlement simultaneously. Enemy raids do not explain the regular 60 to 80-year cycle, the arrangement of goods before burning, or the fact that the communities consistently returned and rebuilt in the same locations afterward. The second theory is practical: soil exhaustion and agricultural renewal. Intensive farming of the same land over 6 or 7 decades would have depleted soil nutrients significantly, even with the application of animal manure. Burning the settlement itself, releasing the nutrients locked in the organic material of the structures, the stored food, the accumulated waste, would have created a powerful fertilizer layer. The ash and burned rubble would have enriched the soil for the next agricultural cycle. This is a real phenomenon. Slash and burn agriculture operates on exactly this principle. And the Cucuteni Tripilia people were sophisticated enough farmers that they would have understood it. The theory has a certain elegant practicality, but it struggles to explain why the burning was so thorough, why the objects inside the houses were preserved rather than removed, and why the same locations were reoccupied rather than new, fresher land being sought. A third theory involves pest control and sanitation. Clay and timber houses, after decades of occupation, would have accumulated significant infestations: mice, rats, insects, parasites embedded in thatching and floor materials. Periodic complete incineration would have been an effective, if extreme, solution to this problem. Fire sterilizes. It kills everything. It resets the sanitary baseline of a site to zero. This explanation has been offered by several scholars as either a primary or a contributing motivation, and there is now an additional dimension to this theory that could not have been anticipated when it was first proposed. Recent paleogenetic studies analyzing ancient DNA extracted from human remains at sites in the broader region have identified the presence of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague, in populations of this period. The plague dimension adds a genuinely new layer of possibility to the burning question. If Yersinia pestis was circulating in Neolithic Europe, and the genetic evidence suggests it was, albeit in forms that may have been less lethal than the medieval Black Death, then a community experiencing a devastating disease outbreak would have had powerful motivation to burn its settlement thoroughly and completely. Fire as quarantine. Fire as purification. This would not have been understood in the germ theory terms we use today, but the empirical observation, burn, the sick house, disease stops spreading, is accessible to any observant community. If this happened even once, the lesson might have been encoded into cultural practice and maintained long after the specific epidemic that prompted it had faded from memory. The fourth and most archaeologically compelling theory is ritual renewal, what some scholars call a termination ritual or closure rite. This framework proposes that the burning was understood by the Cucuteni Tripilia people as a sacred act, the deliberate ceremonial ending of a cycle of habitation performed to allow a new cycle to begin. The house, in this understanding, was not merely a building. It was a living entity with a spirit, a biography, a lifespan. When its time came, it was killed with intention and with ceremony. Everything that had accumulated within it, the objects of daily life, the traces of births and deaths and meals and work, was offered to the fire. And then, from the ash, something new could be born. Ruth Tringham, who has spent decades studying burned Neolithic houses across the broader region, has explored what she calls the emotional and biographical dimensions of this practice. Tringham argues that we should think of the burning not as a cold administrative act, scheduled destruction on the calendar, but as something charged with meaning, grief, perhaps even tenderness. The house you burned was the house where you were born, where your parents died, where your children learned to walk. To burn it was not nothing. It was a rupture and a letting go, and perhaps also a commitment to continuity, the acknowledgement that life requires both ending and beginning, that the new cannot fully arrive until the old has been released. John Chapman, another leading scholar of this culture, developed a related but distinct interpretive framework around what he calls the fragmentation of objects and the deliberate deposition of broken or burned material. Chapman argues that in many Neolithic cultures, the deliberate breaking or destruction of an object, a pot, a figurine, a house, was a form of enchainment, a way of creating and maintaining social bonds. When you break a pot and give half the fragments to a neighbor in a neighboring village, you create a permanent link between your household and theirs. The fragments reunited tell the story of the relationship. Applied to entire settlements, this logic suggests that the burning was not destruction so much as transformation, the conversion of lived space into something permanent, indestructible, and socially meaningful. It is worth pausing on the concept of transformation here, because it runs through almost every credible theory of the burning. Whether the fire was understood as agricultural renewal, as purification, as mortuary ritual, or as spiritual closure, all of these interpretations share a common element. The fire changes something, it converts the old into a new form. Clay walls become ceramic rubble, harder and more permanent than the original material. Organic matter becomes ash, more fertile than the original organic matter. A lived-in space becomes a sacred layer in the earth, fixed, preserved, readable by future archaeology. In each case, the burning is not simple destruction, it is transmutation. The Cucuteni Tripilia people may have been, among many other things, profound practitioners of transformation, a culture organized around the belief that things must die to be reborn. Let us now consider what a burning event would have actually looked like, not in the abstract, but in human terms on the ground in the days and weeks before and after. The settlement has been standing for 60 or 70 years. The elders of the community, those who were children when the last houses were built, would now be approaching the end of their lives. By their memory and by oral tradition, it is time. The preparation would have taken months. The inhabitants of each house would have needed to make decisions. What do we take? What do we leave? What do we offer to the fire? Food stores would need to be relocated or consumed. Animals moved to safer ground. The community's children, those who would build the new settlement, would need to know where and how. The burning itself would have been spectacular, terrifying in its scale, extraordinary in its heat. Experimental reconstruction suggests that a large Cucuteni Tripelia settlement burning all at once would have generated a column of smoke visible for many kilometers in every direction. The heat, if multiple houses were burning simultaneously, would have been intense enough to drive observers back to a considerable distance. The sky above would have turned orange, then black, and the process would have taken time, not hours but days. The slow-burning ceramic rubble piles that archaeologists excavate today represent the end state of fires that smoldered and subsided and smoldered again over extended periods. This was not a flash of destruction. It was a sustained, witnessable communal event. After the fires died and the rubble had cooled, what came next? In the vast majority of documented cases, the answer is more building. The people came back. They leveled the rubble or left it as a raised platform. They laid new house floors directly over the burned remains of the old ones. They rebuilt in the same concentric ring pattern on the same footprints as before, or sometimes expanded the settlement outward to add new rings. The effect over centuries was the gradual accumulation of archaeological layers in a tell, in the terminology of Near Eastern archaeology, each layer representing one complete cycle of building, inhabitation, and burning. At some sites, 4 or 5 distinct cycles of occupation and burning have been identified, each separated by the unmistakable orange-red burn horizon. Now let us look more closely at the objects left inside the houses, because they tell a story of their own. At excavated Cucuteni Tripelia sites, burned house interiors have yielded enormous quantities of ceramic vessels, often stacked or nested within each other, grinding stones for processing grain, clay spindle whorls for spinning wool or plant fibers, loom weights, antler tools, clay models of animals and furniture, and the figurines, those enigmatic small clay humans, predominantly female, that have attracted so much scholarly attention. These were not the disposable belongings of people who had nothing worth saving. These were the material wealth of Neolithic farming families. The deliberate choice to leave them in the burning house, and in many cases, the apparent effort to organize them before the fire, demands explanation. At some excavated sites, archaeologists have found what appear to be assemblages that are more elaborate than the ordinary contents of daily life. At Paduri in Romania, a site known for its exceptional preservation, excavators discovered a group of 21 female figurines arranged on a clay model of a throne or altar, and all together as if posed for a ceremony. At other sites, figurines have been found deliberately buried in pits beneath house floors or arranged in inverted ceramic vessels, a practice that some scholars interpret as magical protection or votive offering. The objects inside the burning houses were not a random collection of domestic debris. They appear, in at least some cases, to have been curated, selected, and arranged for a specific final purpose. What that purpose was, we can only theorize. The pottery of the Cucuteni Tripelia culture deserves a moment of extended attention because it is among the most technically accomplished ceramic production in prehistoric Europe. The potters were not using a full potter's wheel. That technology had not yet arrived in this region, but they appear to have used a slow-turning turntable that allowed them to produce vessels of extraordinary symmetry and formal elegance. The firing temperatures they achieved in their specially constructed kilns, between 900 and 1100 degrees Celsius, are comparable to what a modern pottery studio would produce. The paints they used, mixing iron-rich mineral pigments with organic binders, adhered to the surfaces with a vibrancy and durability that has preserved colors through 5 millennia of burial. The decorative language of the pottery is dense with meaning that we can perceive but not fully translate. The spiral dominates. It appears in hundreds of variations, as a single curve, as a double helix, as an interlocking system of opposing rotations. The meander, a wave-like line that travels back and forth in a regular rhythm, is the second most common element. These two motifs, combined and recombined across the entire period of the culture, form a visual vocabulary of extraordinary richness. Some scholars have interpreted the spirals as representations of water, of serpents, of cosmic cycles. Others see in them a purely abstract aesthetic preference. The honest position is probably somewhere between. These motifs carried meaning, but that meaning has been lost to time, and our attempts to recover it through comparison with other cultures risk projecting more certainty than the evidence supports. Beyond pottery and figurines, the Cucuteni Tripilia people produced a range of other material culture that speaks to the complexity of their society. They worked copper, using cold hammering techniques to produce beads, bracelets, and small tools, obtaining the metal from sources in the Carpathian region. They produced textiles evidenced by spindle whorls and the impressions of woven fabric sometimes preserved in burned clay. They kept and managed livestock with sufficient sophistication that their cattle appear to have been selected for dairy production as well as meat. Their agriculture included wheat, barley, peas, lentils, and other crops. They traded over long distances, exchanging pottery, obsidian, and other goods with communities hundreds of kilometers away. This was not a marginal culture, it was a prosperous, interconnected, materially sophisticated civilization. Let us now return to the megasites because they represent the apex of this civilization's achievement, and because the question of burning takes on a different character at this scale. At Talyanki, at Majdanetske, at Nebelivka, settlements that may have housed many thousands of people, the question of how burning was organized, planned, and executed becomes almost logistically staggering. How do you coordinate the simultaneous or sequential burning of thousands of structures? How do you relocate a population of 20,000 people before igniting their homes? How do you rebuild at that scale with Neolithic tools and technology after the fire? The mere fact that it was done, that the archaeological evidence shows it was done repeatedly at these sites, is astonishing. Some researchers have proposed that the megasites were not burned all at once, but ring by ring, a sequential demolition that would have been more logistically manageable and would have allowed the population to shelter in unburned sections while sections were being destroyed. This model would explain certain features of the archaeological record, including the fact that at some sites the burn layers in different parts of the settlement appear to date to slightly different periods. It would also allow for a kind of choreography of destruction, orderly, staged, controlled, rather than catastrophic. A burning not of panic but of ceremony. Ring by ring, the old city would have been unmade, and ring by ring, the new city would eventually rise in its place. The question of social organization during and after the burning is equally fascinating. Where did people go while their settlement was being rebuilt? The most likely answer is that they dispersed into the surrounding landscape, returning to smaller satellite settlements, camping in the fields, staying with communities in neighboring sites. The Cucuteni Tripilia cultural landscape was not a collection of isolated cities. It was a dense network of settlements spaced at regular intervals linked by trade and social ties. The megasites were the largest nodes in this network, but they were not self-contained. During the rebuilding phase, the network would have absorbed the displaced population, fed them, sheltered them. The burning of one node would have activated the resilience of the whole system. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the Nebelivka excavations specifically because they represent the most scientifically rigorous modern investigation of a Cucuteni Tripilia megasite. The project, led by John Chapman and Biserka Gajdarska in collaboration with Ukrainian archaeologists, employed a full range of modern survey and excavation techniques: magnetometry, geophysics, targeted trenching, and careful radiocarbon dating of sampled materials. What they found complicated the earlier popular picture of the megasites as permanent cities. At Nebelivka, the evidence suggested that different parts of the settlement may have been inhabited at different times, that the full extent of the site may never have been simultaneously occupied at peak capacity. The site may have grown through sequential addition of new rings, with older rings being abandoned or burned as new ones were added. If this interpretation is correct, if the megasites were built and burned incrementally rather than simultaneously at their full extent, then the picture changes somewhat. The burning becomes less a catastrophic end of settlement event and more a continuous process of renewal and expansion built into the very logic of how the community understood its own growth. You build a ring, you inhabit it for a generation, you burn it ritually and deliberately, and you build the next ring slightly outward, incorporating the ash and rubble of what came before into the foundation of what comes next. The settlement grows through a rhythm of creation and destruction that mirrors, in architectural form, the cycle of seasons, growth, fruition, and death that feeds the next growth. The religious life of the Cucuteni Tripilia people is another area where the evidence is rich but the interpretation contested. We know they had sanctuaries, larger structures within settlements that appear to have served ritual functions containing purposely buried or arranged religious objects. We know they produced large numbers of clay figurines that had some kind of ritual significance. We know that the spiral, which dominates their material culture, was not merely decorative but carried symbolic weight. What we do not know and cannot know with the evidence currently available is the nature of their beliefs about the cosmos, the divine, the afterlife, or the relationship between the human world and the supernatural. One remarkable feature of the Cucuteni Tripilia religious or ritual record is the clay models of houses that have been found at some sites. These are small-scale, three-dimensional representations of houses with roof, walls, and interior details that were produced in clay and apparently used in some ritual context. Were they votive offerings, gifts to a deity or spirit? Were they models used in ritual performances that enacted or rehearsed the life cycle of a house? Were they teaching tools used to instruct the next generation in the correct arrangement of domestic space? We cannot say. But the fact that the people made physical representations of the very objects they periodically destroyed suggests that the house was more than a building in their conceptual world. It was something worth representing, worth memorializing, perhaps worth mourning. By around 3,800 to 3,500 years before the Common Era, the Cucuteni Tripilia culture had reached the height of its development. The megasites were at their largest. The pottery was at its most sophisticated. The settlement network extended across an area comparable to modern-day France. The total population of the culture across all its settlements and satellite communities may have approached or even exceeded 1 million people. This was, by any reasonable definition, one of the great civilizations of its age, and then, over a period of several centuries, it began to change. The megasites contracted, the settlement pattern shifted, the distinctive painted pottery began to give way to simpler forms, and eventually, by around 2,750 years before the Common Era, the culture as a coherent, recognizable entity ceased to exist. What ended the Cucuteni Tripilia culture? This question, like so many others surrounding this civilization, does not have a clean, simple answer. Three broad categories of explanation exist in the scholarly literature, and most researchers today believe that the actual collapse involved all three interacting in ways that amplified each other's effects. The first factor was climate. Beginning around 3,200 years before the Common Era, at the end of what geologists call the Holocene climatic optimum, a period of unusual warmth and moisture that had benefited agriculture across Eurasia for millennia, the climate of Eastern Europe shifted. It became colder, drier. The reliable rainfall that had sustained the deep soil agriculture of the forest steppe zone diminished. Drought conditions, in some periods comparable to the American Dust Bowl of the 1930s, struck the heartland of the culture. A civilization organized around intensive grain agriculture, as the Cucuteni Tripilia culture was, would have been acutely vulnerable to sustained drought. The megasites, with their potentially enormous concentrations of population, would have required massive, and reliable agricultural surpluses to feed. When the rains failed, the surpluses would have failed with them. Communities that had been stable for generations would have faced food insecurity for the first time in living memory. The social bonds that held the megasites together and the shared rituals, the communal granaries, the egalitarian compact would have come under pressure they were never designed to bear. And the burning of settlements, which had always been a ritual of renewal, may have taken on a different character when there was genuine uncertainty about whether renewal was still possible. The second major factor in the culture's decline was the arrival of peoples from the Pontic steppe, the grasslands east and north of the Black Sea, who are associated with what archaeologists call the Yamnaya culture. The Yamnaya were a pastoralist, mobile people organized around cattle herding and horse riding. They appear in the archaeological record with certain diagnostic features, burial mounds called kurgans, wheeled vehicles, a different material culture, and, based on recent ancient DNA analysis, a genetic ancestry largely derived from the eastern Eurasian steppe. The geneticist David Reich and his colleagues analyzing ancient human remains from across Europe have demonstrated that Yamnaya-associated ancestry arrived in Eastern Europe in significant quantities beginning around 3,000 years before the Common Era, and that this ancestry rapidly replaced much of the earlier genetic heritage of the Cucuteni Tripilia population. What did the encounter between the Cucuteni Tripilia farmers and the Yamnaya herders look like? Here, the picture is fiercely debated. The earlier influential model, now championed by Maria Gimbutas as part of her Kurgan hypothesis, proposed a violent invasion, warlike steppe nomads descending on peaceful agricultural communities and destroying them by force. The archaeological evidence for the Cucuteni Tripilia side of this encounter is thin. The culture's settlements, as noted earlier, showed minimal militarization for most of their history. Very few weapons, no defensive walls at the major sites, almost no skeletal remains showing weapon trauma. Until a relatively late phase when some enclosing ditches and other features appeared. This does not quite fit the picture of a society that had long been under sustained military threat. J.P. Mallory, one of the leading scholars of Indo-European prehistory, offered a more nuanced reading of the evidence. Rather than a sudden violent conquest, Mallory argued for a long process of cultural interaction, intermarriage, and gradual displacement, perhaps spanning several centuries. Hybrid cultures appear in the archaeological record at the edges of the Cucuteni Tripilia zone. The Usatovo culture, flourishing from around 3,500 to 3,000 years before the Common Era, shows a striking mixture of Tripilia ceramic traditions with steppe cultural elements including kurgan burials and new weapon types. These hybrid communities may represent the frontier zone where the two worlds were actively interpenetrating, creating something new, even as they dissolved the coherence of what had come before. The ancient DNA evidence adds a layer of biological reality to this cultural picture. Studies published in the last decade, including work by Reich's group at Harvard and collaborating researchers, show that modern Eastern Europeans carry significant amounts of Yamnaya-related ancestry, and that this ancestry arrived in the region broadly during the third millennium before the Common Era. The Cucuteni Tripilia genetic heritage was not entirely erased. It was absorbed, diluted, and transformed. The people who survived the decline of the culture did not disappear. They intermarried with incoming populations, adopted new practices, and contributed their genes and perhaps some of their knowledge and traditions to the mixed communities that followed. The fire of the culture was banked, not extinguished. There is a particular irony, one that a culture of cyclical renewal might perhaps have appreciated, in the fact that the last phase of the Cucuteni Tripilia tradition may itself have ended in fire. Some late-phase sites show destruction layers that do not fit the ordered pattern of ritual burning. Settlements that appear to have been abandoned in haste, with debris suggesting sudden departure rather than planned dismantling. houses where the burning appears to have spread rather than been set deliberately. Whether these final destructions represent genuine violence or desperate replication of a ritual that no longer had the social infrastructure to support it is impossible to say from the archaeological evidence alone, but they mark a rupture. They mark an ending that felt different from the controlled endings that came before. By 2,750 years before the Common Era, give or take a few centuries depending on the region, the Cucuteni Tripilia culture as a recognizable archaeological entity had ended. The megasites were empty, not burned in the ritual cycle, not rebuilt, just abandoned. The distinctive painted pottery had given way to simpler forms associated with incoming steppe cultures. The concentric ring settlement pattern had dissolved. The spiral motif, after more than 2,000 years of dominance, faded from the material record. What remained was the land, the rich black soil of Ukraine and Moldova, and the people who continued to inhabit it, carrying fragments of memory, tradition, and biology from a world that had vanished. For most of the modern era, the Cucuteni Tripilia culture remained obscure, known to specialists, ignored by general histories of the ancient world, overshadowed by the more glamorous civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. The reasons for this obscurity are partly political and partly academic. The culture's territory spanned countries that were separated by the Iron Curtain for most of the 20th century, making collaborative international research difficult. Romanian, Soviet, Ukrainian, and Moldovan archaeologists worked in relative isolation, publishing in languages not widely read in Western academic circles. The spectacular pottery found its way into museums in Kyiv and Bucharest, but not into the blockbuster narratives of Western history books. That is changing. The last 2 decades have seen an explosion of scholarly interest in the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, driven by new archaeological techniques, new interdisciplinary collaborations, and the dissolution of the political barriers that had separated national research traditions. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry have allowed archaeologists to map the full extent of megasites without excavating them, revealing their true size and complexity for the first time. Ancient DNA analysis has transformed our understanding of the people who lived and died in these settlements, and a new generation of scholars, and including the British-Ukrainian project at Nebelivka and research teams from Germany, Romania, and beyond, have brought the methods and questions of modern archaeology to a culture that had long been understudied. The question of the burning remains, despite all this new scholarship, genuinely open. No consensus has emerged. Different scholars looking at the same evidence reach different conclusions. Ruth Tringham emphasizes the emotional and biographical dimensions. The burning as a meaningful act of closure, performed by people who understood their houses as living entities. John Chapman highlights the social logic of fragmentation and enchainment, the burning as a mechanism for creating permanent social memory. Others emphasize the practical dimensions of sanitation, soil renewal, or disease control. Still others increasingly point to the plague evidence and suggest that some burnings at least were driven by epidemic crisis. The multiplicity of explanations may itself be the most accurate picture. Human behaviors, especially sacred ones, are rarely monocausal. What seems increasingly clear, however, and this represents something of a scholarly consensus in the current literature, is that the burning was not a negative event in the understanding of the people who performed it. It was not a destruction, it was a transformation. The language that archaeologists now reach for most naturally is the language of ritual closure, renewal, and regeneration. The burned house was a completed house, a house that had fulfilled its purpose, run its course, and been given the ending it was due. The ashes were not ruins, they were foundations, and the new settlement that rose from them was not a replacement but a continuation. The next chapter of an ongoing story that the community understood itself as living. As there is a concept from anthropology that may help us here, the concept of structured time. Many traditional societies organize their understanding of time not as a linear progression from past to future, the model that dominates modern Western thinking, but as a cyclical structure in which certain patterns repeat: seasons, generations, ritual cycles. In such a framework, the burning of a settlement is not an interruption of continuity. It is the mechanism by which continuity is maintained. The cycle of building, inhabiting, burning, and rebuilding is not a series of catastrophes. It is the rhythm of life itself, scaled up to the level of the community. The settlement that burns is not dying. It is completing a cycle. And in completing the cycle, it ensures that the next cycle can begin. Consider the spiral, that most characteristic motif of Cucuteni Tripilia art. A spiral does not return to where it began. Unlike a circle, which closes perfectly, a spiral moves outward from each revolution, arriving at a point slightly further than where it started. Scholars who favor symbolic interpretations of the culture's art have noted this quality of the spiral: its combination of repetition and progression, its encoding of the idea that each cycle, while resembling the last, carries you to a new place. If the burning cycle was, for the Cucuteni Tripilia people, what the spiral was for their pottery, a symbol of time that is both recurring and moving forward, then we have perhaps found the deepest available metaphor for what they were doing. They were not going in circles. They were moving through time in a spiral. Each burning returned them to the same ritual moment. Each rebuilding took them somewhere new. There is one more piece of evidence worth examining, one that sits at the intersection of the burning question and the question of social organization. At several Cucuteni Tripilia sites, what archaeologists have found is not just burned houses, but burned assembly buildings. The large communal structures that appear to have served as gathering places for the broader community. These assembly buildings, when they were burned, were sometimes treated differently from ordinary houses. The objects found within them suggest a more elaborate closing ritual. The scale of the burning was sometimes more intensive. The suggestion that emerges is that the burning of the assembly building, the heart of the community's social life, may have been the central event of the burning ceremony, with the burning of individual houses being secondary, organized around the destruction of the communal center. What would it mean to burn your community's gathering place, your hall of feasts, of decisions, of marriages and disputes and celebrations? To burn the place where you had sat with your neighbors through winter storms and heard the old stories told? This was not simply the destruction of a building, it was the deliberate dismantling of the physical container of collective memory and shared life. And yet, the community did it, deliberately, periodically, and then built a new one. Perhaps the message was this: our community is not the building. The building is just the current vessel for something that cannot be burned. The social bonds, the shared knowledge, the identity that persists across cycles of destruction and renewal. The hall dies, the community lives. 5,000 years later, we are still trying to understand what these people were doing. And in a curious way, the effort to understand the Cucuteni Tripilia burning may tell us as much about ourselves as it does about them. Our instinct, shaped by thousands of years of Western history in which cities are places of accumulation, of permanence, of investment in the future, is to see the burning as a problem, a mystery, something that needs to be explained away. But perhaps the true mystery is the assumption that lies beneath the question, the assumption that what you build, you must keep. The Cucuteni Tripilia people apparently did not share this assumption. For them, keeping was not the point. Renewal was the point. In recent years, the plight of these ancient sites has taken on a painful new dimension. The heart of the Cucuteni Tripilia cultural territory and the forest steppe zone of central Ukraine has been the site of active military operations since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. Sites that archaeologists had been painstakingly studying, including areas near the locations of known megasites, have been in or near conflict zones. The condition of specific sites has been difficult to assess from a distance. The war has disrupted ongoing research, endangered field teams, and created a situation in which the preservation of irreplaceable archaeological heritage has had to compete with the immediate demands of a population in crisis. The ancient cities that were built to be burned now face a new kind of threat, one that their builders could not have conceived. And yet the culture endures, in a different sense. The Cucuteni Tripilia artistic tradition has become a touchstone of national identity in Romania and in Ukraine particularly, connecting modern populations to a deep heritage that predates the recorded history of both nations by thousands of years. The painted spiral motif appears in modern Ukrainian embroidery, in folk art, in contemporary design. The figurines have become symbols of cultural resilience. At a time when Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian identity are under existential pressure, the recovery of this 5,000-year heritage carries a weight that goes beyond academic archaeology. It says, we have been here before. We have survived before. We have burned our world before, and we have built it again. What ultimately do we take from the story of the Cucuteni Tripilia people? There are several layers of lesson available depending on what we are looking for. For archaeologists, this culture remains a productive challenge, a test case for how we think about urbanism, social organization, and complexity in the deep past. The megasites demand that we expand our definitions. The burning demands that we examine our assumptions. The absence of temples and palaces demands that we question whether hierarchy and centralization are necessary features of large-scale human organization, or whether they are simply features of the particular civilizational models we happen to know best. For those of us who are not archaeologists, the Cucuteni Tripilia story offers something more personal. Here was a civilization that lasted nearly 3,000 years, longer than the entire span of recorded Western history from ancient Greece to the present day. A civilization that, without written language, without metal tools for most of its existence, without horses or wheels, or the institutions of state power, organized tens of thousands of people into communities of remarkable sophistication and apparent stability. And the secret of its longevity, if we can call it a secret, may have been precisely the practice that seems most strange to modern eyes: the willingness to let go, to burn what has been built, to trust that the new will come. 3,000 years is a staggering duration. For comparison, it is approximately the distance in time from the Cucuteni Tripilia burning rituals to us. The same span of time separates us from them as separates the peak of their culture from its earliest origins. We are living in the middle of their story, in a sense. They burned their first settlements while the pyramids of Egypt had not yet been conceived. They were still building megasites when the Trojan War was being fought. By the time their culture faded, Moses was within a few centuries of his exodus. The Cucuteni Tripilia people did not know any of this. They knew their river valleys, their cattle, their kilns. They knew the smell of freshly painted clay and the heat of a fire that they had chosen to set. The fires they set left something extraordinary behind. The vitrified clay rubble of their burned houses is not merely a destruction layer, it is a record, one of the most detailed records of daily Neolithic life that archaeology possesses anywhere in the world. Because the fires hardened the clay walls to ceramic, they preserved the impressions of wooden structural elements that would otherwise have rotted away. They preserved the shape of baskets, textile fragments, wooden tool captured in clay before the wood burned. They preserved the arrangement of household goods exactly as they were placed at the moment of the burning. In destroying their houses, the Cucuteni Tripilia people inadvertently created archives. The fire that was meant to end everything instead preserved everything. This is perhaps the deepest irony of the burned house horizon. The act of destruction is also an act of preservation. The fires that the Cucuteni Tripilia people set generation after generation in what they understood as a ritual of renewal also produced an archaeological record of extraordinary richness. Had they simply abandoned their settlements and let them decay, the wooden structures would have rotted, the clay would have washed away, the objects would have dispersed. The ordinary processes of time would have swallowed the evidence. Instead, the fire fixed everything in place, locked the moment of the burning into the geological record with the permanence of ceramic. The Cucuteni Tripilia people could not have known they were doing this, but the effect is that their moments of ending are among the best preserved moments in all of European prehistory. We do not know the name of a single person who lived in the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, not one. Their language has left no written record, no inscription, no tablet, no carving preserves even a syllable of what they spoke. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what they called their gods. If they had gods in any sense we would recognize. We do not know the name of the woman who painted the most beautiful vessel ever found at Cucuteni. We do not know the name of the engineer, if that is even the right word, who first designed the concentric ring settlement pattern that would define their civilization for 2,000 years. We do not know the name of the elder who, one autumn morning 5,000 years ago, gave the signal that it was time to begin. And yet, and this is the extraordinary thing, they are not entirely gone. The genes of the Cucuteni Tripilia people survive in modern Europeans. Their soil enrichment practices contributed to the agricultural productivity of a region that still feeds much of the world. Their artistic tradition, the spiral, the meander, the painted clay, echoes in the folk art of Ukraine and Romania to this day. And now, through the patient work of archaeologists and geneticists and experimental scientists, their story is being recovered from the layers of ash they left behind. Every year, the picture becomes a little more complete. Every excavation, every radiocarbon date, every ancient genome analyzed adds another fragment to the image of a civilization that was, by any measure, extraordinary. The question we started with, why would a people burn their own thriving cities again and again, does not have a single answer. It probably never will. The Cucuteni Tripilia burning is not a puzzle that yields to a single correct solution. It is a window onto a form of human experience that is radically different from our own and radically illuminating precisely because of that difference. These were people who understood time differently than we do, who understood the relationship between the built environment and the human community differently than we do, who had worked out over generations of practice and oral tradition a set of answers to the fundamental questions of how to live together. Answers that are not our answers, that do not map onto our categories, that resist our instinct for a tidy explanation. Perhaps the most honest thing we can say at the end of this exploration is this. The Cucuteni Tripilia people built some of the largest and most sophisticated settlements of their age. They sustained those settlements and the complex social world they contained for nearly 3,000 years, a span of time that dwarfs the duration of most civilizations we consider great. They did it without kings and without priests in pyramids and without armies of bronze-armed soldiers, and built into the very practice that sustained them was an act that looks from the outside like destruction, but that was, for them, the opposite. It was the mechanism of survival. The choice to burn was the choice to endure, not by clinging to what had been built, but by being willing always to begin again. Before we close, one final thought. Somewhere beneath the agricultural fields of central Ukraine, beneath the wheat and sunflower fields, beneath the rich black soil that the Cucuteni Tripilia farmers themselves helped create, there are burn layers. Orange-red seams of fired clay running through the stratigraphy, marking the moments when, by collective decision, entire cities were consigned to flame. Those layers are still there. They have been there for 5,000 years. They will be there long after we are gone. The fire that the elders ordered is still, in a geological sense, burning, preserved in the permanence of ceramic, in the indestructible record of the earth. The Cucuteni Tripilia people may have intended to destroy, but what they left behind was permanent. Sometimes the most lasting things we do are the ones we thought were endings. If this story has drawn you deeper into the world of lost civilizations and the mysteries they left behind, there is another culture, another forgotten epoch, waiting for you in our next exploration. A civilization that built its monuments not from clay and timber, but from something far less expected, in a landscape where no civilization was supposed to exist, leaving behind questions that are still being argued over by the world's leading archaeologists today. The past is never finished. It is always burning. We will see you there.